The woman who killed herself for a war hero. Mystic Chapters. Where the hell did you learn that? Dr. Graham Wexler stood over the dying man, staring at the catheter balloon a triage nurse had just packed into a wound no instrument in the hospital could reach. Talia Mercer answered in a whisper, "Night Stalkers don't quit." For 2 years and 4 months, Ardmore Regional had known her as the quiet one at the triage desk. None of them knew she had been a flight medic with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. She had saved a stranger's life with hands the Army had trained, and the man whose blood was drying on her forearms was not a stranger at all. In less than an hour, a defense intelligence officer would lock down the entire hospital because of him. Welcome to Mystic Chapters, the channel that finds the extraordinary people hiding behind ordinary lives. If you like stories about people who carry more than anyone around them ever guesses, take a second and subscribe. We tell one of these every week, and there's a lot more of this coming. At 3 in the morning, the emergency department at Ardmore Regional Medical Center held the particular stillness that belonged only to the people who worked inside it. The waiting room had emptied out around 1. On the far side of the automatic doors, the wind pushed sleet across the ambulance bay in long gray sheets, and the west side of Chicago lay under it, the way a city does at that hour, awake in patches, mostly not. Talia Mercer sat at the triage desk with her back to the wall. She had sat that way for 2 years and 4 months, long enough that the other nurses had stopped moving her chair back to the position the ergonomics consultant had recommended. From where she sat, she could see the ambulance doors, the waiting room entrance, and the corridor that led to the trauma bays all at once without turning her head. Nobody had ever asked her why that mattered. She was 34 years old, and the staff at Ardmore knew a handful of things about her. She never called in sick. She never raised her voice, not even the night a man high on something came through the doors, swinging a length of pipe. She took her breaks alone in the stairwell instead of the break room. And when she came back, her coffee was always still full, as though she had forgotten it was there. She listened more than she talked. And when she did talk, it was usually a number, a pressure, a rate, a time. There were other things about her that nobody had bothered to notice because they did not look like anything. When she checked a pulse, she did it by touch at the wrist and watched the patient's face instead of the monitor. When she walked into a room, she came through the doorway at an angle rather than straight on. When someone dropped a metal tray behind her, she did not startle. She simply turned, located the sound, and turned back. And the whole motion took less than a second and looked like nothing at all. 5 years earlier, Sergeant Talia Mercer had been a flight medic with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, and most of what she had done in that job did not exist on any document she was permitted to read. She had worked in the dark, in a helicopter cabin at 200 feet, with the doors open and the airframe shuddering, and a man's blood pooling in the well of the deck where her boots were braced. She had learned to do things there that no civilian nursing program in the United States taught, because no civilian nursing program had any reason to. She had left the Army after a night she had never described to anyone, and she had gone looking for the most ordinary work she could find. Triage suited her. Triage was a room full of people who needed to be sorted by how fast they were dying, and she was very good at that. And nobody at Ardmore had ever thought to ask why. The trauma surgeon on that night was Graham Wexler, and Wexler had a reputation that arrived in a room before he did. He was 41, trained at a program that put his name on a short list, and he was genuinely excellent, which was the part people tended to leave out when they complained about him. He read every chart twice. He confirmed every verbal order in writing before he touched a patient. He had once sent a resident home in the middle of a shift for administering a drug that was correct, in a dose that was correct, without having said the dose out loud first. The staff called it arrogance because arrogance was the easiest name for it. 6 years earlier, at a different hospital, a nurse Wexler had trusted completely had gone around a protocol because her instinct told her the protocol was wrong. That night her instinct had been wrong. The patient had died, and Wexler had been the one who sat in the family room afterward with the man's wife and 2 daughters, and he had been the one whose signature was on the chart when the attorneys came. He never spoke about it. He simply never allowed anything to happen in his department that he had not personally said out loud first. Leona Briggs had the Bay assignment that night, and had worked beside Talia for most of those 2 years. She was the sort of nurse who filled silences without minding whether they got filled back. And she had noticed things about Talia that the rest of the department had walked past. She had noticed that Talia knew what a blast injury looked like from the outside before anyone opened the patient's shirt. She had noticed once that Talia used the word casualty and then corrected herself to patient a half-second later. She had never said anything about it because it had never seemed like the kind of thing you said. At 18 minutes past 3, a silver sedan came into the ambulance bay from the wrong direction, drove up over the painted curb and stopped. 2 men got out, opened the rear door, dragged a 3rd man onto the wet concrete, and left him there. The sedan was back out onto Costner Avenue before the automatic doors had finished opening. He was somewhere in his 40s, heavy through the shoulders, gray at the temples, and there was no wallet on him, and nothing in his pockets at all. Leona and a transport tech got him onto a gurney, and Talia was already walking beside it with one hand on his throat. By the time they reached the trauma bay, she had the number she needed, and did not like it. The wound was under the left collarbone, just inside the shoulder, and it went in and did not come out. It was a location that made everything simple and impossible at once. There was nothing to tie a tourniquet around. There was nothing solid underneath to compress the vessel against. The blood was not spilling out onto the sheet in any dramatic way, which was exactly the problem, because it was going somewhere else, into the chest cavity, where nobody could see it and nobody could stop it. Wexler was in the 2nd operating suite with a bowel perforation and had been for an hour. The physician on the floor was a 2nd-year resident named Peter Howren, who was 29 and had been awake for 22 hours, and who had both hands on the patient's shoulder and was pressing down with everything he had, which was accomplishing nothing. Talia said it aloud once, the way she had been trained to say things. Subclavian junctional. No compressible landmark. He is filling his chest. Howren did not look up. He said he had paged vascular and that the consult would be down. He said it twice, and his voice climbed a half step the 2nd time, and the number on the monitor came down 9 points while he was saying it. Nobody was going to arrive in time. Talia had known that from the doorway, and she had known it the way you know a thing you have known before. In a different room, on a different continent, with a different man on the floor in front of you. She turned to the supply cart, and what she took off, it did not belong to trauma surgery at all. A Foley catheter, the kind used to drain a bladder, sealed in its sterile sleeve, along with a syringe, saline, a clamp, and a roll of tape. She fed the catheter into the wound tract along the path the projectile had taken, past the point where Howren's hands had been doing nothing. Then she took the syringe and inflated the balloon at the tip with 30 milliliters of saline, watching the man's face while she did it. When the balloon seated against the torn vessel from the inside, she felt it stop the same way a cork stops, and she clamped the catheter, taped it down, and pulled the skin closed around it with her free hand. Then everyone in the room stood and watched the monitor, and the number stopped falling and hung there for a stretch of seconds that felt considerably longer than it was. and then it began to climb. Leona had not moved from the foot of the gurney the entire time. She was looking at the catheter, and then she was looking at Talia's hands, which were not shaking, and had not shaken, and were now unhurriedly retaping a corner of the dressing that had lifted. Wexler came through the trauma bay door at 3:25. His own case had closed 3 minutes earlier, and he had left the fascia to his senior resident when the operating suite phone rang, because Howren had finally called upstairs instead of paging vascular a third time. He stopped at the end of the gurney and looked at the man's chest, at the pressure holding, at the color coming back into the face, at the thing taped into the wound that had no business being there and was unmistakably working. Where the hell did you learn that? Talia was still looking at the patient. She answered so quietly that Leona, standing 3 feet away, was the only other person in the room who heard the whole of it. Night stalkers don't quit. Wexler did not ask what that meant. He did not say thank you. He stepped in, examined the seal, confirmed that the balloon was seated, ordered the operating suite prepped, and worked for the next half hour beside a woman he did not speak to again. At 4 minutes past 4, after the vessel had been repaired, and the patient was upstairs and no longer his problem, he went into the charting room and filed a report, with risk management describing a procedure performed outside the scope of nursing practice. And he entered Talia Mercer's name in the field where the name goes. The elevator opened at 8 minutes past 4, and 3 men came out of it who did not belong to any hospital. The one in front was in his late 30s in a gray civilian coat that did not disguise the way he wore it. He showed the charge nurse a credential from the Defense Intelligence Agency and asked for the trauma department by name. His name was Adam Pike, and he held the rank of major, and he had not driven through sleet at that hour because a hospital had filed a report about a nurse. He had driven because a fingerprint set submitted routinely at intake had come back matched to a file that was supposed to be closed. The man on the gurney was Malcolm Stroud. He had been a sergeant in United States Army Special Forces, an explosives specialist, and he had been carried on the rolls as killed in action for 5 years. He was now employed by an organization called the Kestrel Group, which was not on any list the public was permitted to see, and which was currently in possession of something that had gone missing from an armory in Indiana. 3 weeks earlier, Pike found Talia in the corridor, outside the recovery unit, with Wexler 10 feet behind her and Leona in the doorway of the supply room. And he did the one thing that nobody at Ardmore Regional had ever done in that building. "Sergeant Mercer," he said. Wexler's head came up. Leona's hand stopped on the shelf she had been reaching for. In 2 years and 4 months, no one there had heard those 2 words attached to that name. And there was a moment in that corridor when the woman standing in the scrubs was somebody the 2 of them had never met. Talia heard the rank, and she heard the name of the man she had saved. And the second one landed considerably harder than the first. 5 years earlier, on a night outside Kandahar, a directional mine had been emplaced against a wall along a route her crew flew twice a week. It had been placed by someone with the training to know exactly where the aircraft would flare and exactly how high, and it had been placed by an American. 3 of her crew had died on that wall, and she had spent the last 5 years not saying their names out loud. The man whose blood was still drying on her forearms was the man who put it there. The corridor outside the recovery unit stayed quiet for a few seconds after Pike said the name, and then it stopped being quiet, because Pike had come there to work and not to observe. He told Talia what the man upstairs was worth. 3 weeks earlier, an armory outside Terre Haute, Indiana, had come up short on an inventory reconciliation, and what it had come up short by was 41 pounds of composition C4 and a case of non-electric initiators. The paperwork had been clean. The seals had been intact. Somebody with a key had walked it out over the course of 2 nights and made the numbers agree. And the only reason anyone had noticed at all was a warehouse sergeant who counted things twice on principle. Stroud's fingerprints had put him inside that building on the 2nd night, and Stroud was the only human being currently breathing who knew where the material had gone afterward. Pike said the rest of it plainly, the way men say things when they have already decided to say them. The people who had dumped him in that ambulance bay had not been trying to save him. They had been trying to leave him somewhere he would die on somebody else's floor with no wallet and no name, and be buried by the county under a number. He stays alive, Pike said, whatever that takes. He is the only thread we have, and it runs out tonight. Talia listened to all of it without changing anything in her face, and Wexler, standing 10 feet behind her with the blood drying on his cuffs, watched her not change, and found that he disliked it intensely. He had spent 6 years building a department where nothing happened that had not been said out loud first. And in the space of 50 minutes, a woman on his floor had performed a procedure he had never authorized, and a federal officer had walked into his hospital and addressed her by a rank that appeared nowhere in her personnel file. Marilyn Vance arrived at 22 minutes past 4, which was fast for an administrator who had been asleep in Oak Park when the call came. She was the director of risk management at Ardmore Regional, and she had a way of speaking that made the worst sentence in a conversation sound like the 3rd or 4th most important one. She read Wexler's incident report in the charting room with her coat still on, and she read Howren's written statement underneath it, which contained the only sentence anybody would remember from it, that in his clinical judgment, the patient would have arrested within 90 seconds without the intervention. Then she asked Talia a series of questions, and Talia answered every one of them accurately and none of them completely. Yes, she had placed the catheter. Yes, she had inflated the balloon. No, she had not received a verbal order. No, the procedure was not within the scope of practice for a registered nurse in the state of Illinois. No, she did not have anything to add. Vance explained that the hospital had no choice, and the phrasing was interesting, because a hospital always has a choice and simply prefers not to have made one. Talia would be relieved of patient contact effective immediately, pending review. The nursing board would be notified within 72 hours. There would be an interview with counsel present, and it would be better for everyone if she did not discuss the incident with staff in the interim. The recommendation required a physician's signature, and Wexler signed it there in the charting room with the pen from his own coat pocket, and did not look up while he did. Leona Briggs saw the whole exchange from the doorway of the medication room, where she had been standing for longer than she had any business standing. When Vance and Wexler went out toward the administrative wing, she followed Talia into the supply room and shut the door behind them. She had been putting it together since 3:25, and she had most of it, and what she did not have, she had guessed. She had watched a woman she had worked beside for 2 years reach past every instrument in a trauma bay for a urinary catheter and use it to stop an arterial bleed. She had done it without hesitating, without checking a reference, without asking anyone. "You knew that would work," Leona said. "You didn't think it might work. You knew." Talia was refolding a stack of dressings that did not need refolding. She said that she had done it 9 times before tonight. She did not say where, and Leona did not ask where, because the answer had already been said out loud in the corridor by a man with a federal credential. And because the thing about knowing somebody for 2 years is that you find out at the end of it how much of the knowing was assumption. What Leona did ask was whether Talia had understood, when she reached for that cart, what it was going to cost her. Talia set the dressings down and said that the cost had not been part of the calculation. Then she went out of the supply room and up the east stairwell to the 2nd floor, where she was no longer permitted to be, because nobody had yet gotten around to telling the surgical recovery unit that she had been relieved of patient contact. Malcolm Stroud woke up at 10 minutes to 5. He came up out of it the way men do who have been under before and know the shape of the ceiling that greets them. He took inventory first. The ceiling, the lines, the drain, the flex cuff around his left wrist that Pike's people had run through the bed rail. Then he found the woman sitting in the chair against the far wall, and something moved across his face that was not confusion. He looked at her for a long moment and said her name, not the name on her badge. The one that had been on a flight suit 5 years earlier with the rank in front of it. She did not ask how he knew it. There were only 2 ways he could know it, and both of them meant that the mine on that wall outside Kandahar had not been placed against a route. It had been placed against an aircraft and against the people inside it, and somebody had been given their names. Stroud's voice came out thin and torn from the tube they had taken out of him an hour before. He told her he had felt some of it, at the edges, the pressure going in, the cold of the saline, her hand on his throat. He told her he had known it was her before he opened his eyes, because there were maybe 40 people alive in the world who could do what had been done to him in that bay, and he had met most of them. Then he said the thing he had been building toward. You had it in your hands. Nobody in that room knew what they were looking at. You could have gone 4 minutes slower, and no one on this earth would have known the difference. Not the doctor, not the resident, not one soul. He turned his head enough to see her fully. Why didn't you? Talia did not answer him for some time. And what went through her while she did not answer was not mercy, and it was not anything close to it. She thought about the wall. She thought about the way the aircraft had come around and flared exactly where it always flared, because that was the approach. And the approach was the approach for good reasons. And somebody who had been taught those same good reasons had used them as a firing solution. She thought about 3 names she had not said out loud in 5 years, and she found that she could still hear how each of them had sounded over the intercom, and that this had not gotten better with time, and was not going to. She also thought about 41 pounds of composition C4, sitting somewhere in the state of Illinois, in a rented garage or a storage unit or the back of a panel van, and about the fact that the man in front of her was the only human being alive who could say where. 41 pounds is not a number that means anything to most people. It had meant something specific to Talia since a briefing room in 2017. It is a loading dock, or a transformer yard, or the base of a parking structure, or the front of a building where people stand in line at 8 in the morning holding coffee. None of those people had been at Kandahar. None of them had been anywhere. That was the entire point of them. She told Stroud that he was going to live, and that he was going to talk, and that she was going to sit in that chair until one of those things had happened. She did not tell him she forgave him, because she did not, and she was not going to lie to him about it at 5 in the morning after everything else. He laughed at that, or made the sound that was available to him, and said that she had not changed. She told him he had no idea whether that was true, and that was the last thing either of them said for a long while. Her shift had 4 hours left on it, and she had been relieved of patient contact 90 minutes into it. And she stayed in that chair anyway because the room had 1 door and 1 window, and a man in it whom 3 separate parties now had reasons to want silenced. At 15 minutes past 5, an ambulance came into the receiving bay without calling ahead. Talia saw it through the window at the end of the recovery corridor, which looked down on the bay, and she was moving toward the stairwell before she had finished assembling the reason. It was a private transfer unit, and the lettering on the side said Meridian Medical Transport, and it had backed in cleanly and squarely, which is not how anyone parks a rig in sleet at that hour when there is a patient in the back. She came down into the receiving corridor as the doors opened, and what she had was about 10 seconds, and she did not need most of them. The straps on the backboard were run high across the chest and again across the upper abdomen, with nothing at the pelvis, which is backward, and which no working medic in the country does, because it is the first thing anybody teaches and the last thing anybody forgets. The head blocks were seated but not taped. There was an intravenous bag hanging on the rail, full to the neck, and the line running down from it had never been spiked. And the man walking in front of the gurney came through the doorway and looked at the ceiling corners, then the far exit, then the nurse's station, and did not look at his patient once. Clipped to his collar was a Meridian identification badge belonging to a technician whose actual shift had ended in Berwyn 2 hours earlier, and whose crew had not been heard from since. Talia did not shout. Shouting would have told 3 men with a plan exactly where the problem was standing, and would have put every person in that corridor on their feet and facing the wrong way. She went 8 steps to her left, to the wall panel beside the Wing B service door, and pulled the fire alarm. The building did what buildings do. The horns came up. The smoke barriers dropped shut on their hold opens. The emergency lighting cut in, and the overhead voice began directing Wing B to horizontal evacuation, east compartment. Every patient, every tech, every nurse on that floor started moving east through the cross-corridor doors and away from the receiving bay, away from the elevator lobby, away from the west stairs, away from every route that ran between 3 armed men and the second floor. In 9 seconds, Talia had emptied the entire path they were going to walk. Then, and only then, she took out her phone, called the number Pike had written on the back of a triage slip, and pressed into her hand an hour earlier, and told him that they were already in the building. He told her he was 15 minutes out. Graham Wexler had come out of the administrative wing at the sound of the horns, and he saw the last of it, the 8 steps, the pull, the absolute economy of it. A woman who had not run, had not warned anyone, had not raised her voice, and who had cleared a wing in one direction she had chosen on purpose. He had spent an hour and 50 minutes that night believing he had watched a nurse gamble with a man's life and get lucky. Standing in that corridor with the horns going, and every patient in Wing B moving safely east, he understood that he had not been watching improvisation at all. He had been watching a protocol. It was simply not one that had ever been written down in any manual his hospital owned. The horns had been going for 9 seconds when the 3 men in the receiving corridor understood what had been done to them. The floor they had planned to cross was empty in the wrong direction, and the only people left anywhere near their route were the ones they had come to kill. The man who had walked in front of the gurney said something short to the other 2, and they abandoned the backboard where it stood with its straps run high and its intravenous line that had never been spiked, and they moved. 2 went for the west service stairs. 1 stayed with the rig. Talia watched all of it from the doorway of the linen alcove 9 feet away, counted them, memorized the coats, the boots, the way the tall one carried his right hand at his belt line, and then went up the east stairwell 2 steps at a time with the horns hammering the concrete around her. She reached the 2nd floor ahead of them, and the first thing she did there was not go to the room. She went to the utility closet behind the nurse's station and killed the lighting circuits for the entire recovery wing. The emergency fixtures stayed lit because they are on a separate supply, and she had counted on that. What they gave was a strip of dim white at floor level and nothing above waist height. She had learned in a place with no lights at all that darkness is not the same thing for everyone standing in it. It is a disadvantage to the man who does not know the room. It is a tool to the woman who has walked the same 140 feet of it 4 nights a week for 2 years. The security officer posted outside Stroud's door was 58 years old and carried a radio and nothing else. She sent him east after the patients with 3 words and a hand on his shoulder, because the alternative to sending him away was watching him die in a hallway. Stroud was already awake and already understood. She cut the flex cuff with trauma shears, and when she rolled him toward the transport gurney, he got his good arm under himself and took part of his own weight, which was the only assistance available in that room, and was enough. She hung nothing and took nothing. She pushed him out through the door at the back of the recovery unit that opened onto the soiled linen corridor, a route that existed on no visitor map and appeared on no floor plan posted in any elevator lobby. It ran behind the patient rooms, past the 2 chutes, and ended at a service car. Every nurse and every tech in that building used it a dozen times a shift, and nobody who had studied the hospital from the outside knew it was there. The alarm had already recalled the car to the ground floor and locked it out, the way an alarm is supposed to. Talia had the fireman's service key on the ring in her pocket, the same ring every charge nurse on that unit carried for exactly this reason, and she put it in the panel and turned it and took manual control of the car, and it came up for her, because she was the only person in that building who was going to think of it. At the mouth of the linen corridor, she stopped long enough to lay a full oxygen cylinder on its side across the doorway at ankle height, wedged against the frame, where a man moving fast in the dark would find it with his shins before his eyes found it at all. The car took a long time coming. Stroud lay on the gurney with his color gray under the emergency lighting and the drain still running out from under his collarbone, and he said into the dark that they were not coming for her, as though the distinction ought to comfort somebody. She told him to be quiet, and he was. Down in the basement. The mechanical level ran the length of the building under the parking structure, low ceiling and loud, full of pipe and conduit, and the standing roar of the air handlers. The stair from the parking garage came up at the east end, and that was the only way in from the outside, and that was where Major Adam Pike and his men were going to arrive. The man who had walked in front of the gurney upstairs got there first. He came out of the west stairwell with a flashlight in his left hand and a canvas bag in his right, and he went straight to the garage stair door and knelt. Talia, 90 feet away behind the return air plenum with a gurney and a wounded man, watched him take out of that bag a block of composition C4 the size of a paperback, a coil of green time fuse, and a crimped non-electric cap. She knew the case that had come out of. She had known it since Pike said the words in the corridor upstairs, and seeing it in a man's hand under a flashlight in the basement of a hospital did something to her that all the rest of that night had not managed. He pressed the block into the seam of the steel door at chest height, seated the cap, ran the fuse out along the floor, and went back toward cover to wait, because a charge in a doorway does not need to kill anyone to be useful. It only needs to close the doorway and to make the men on the other side of it stop and think very hard about the next one. Talia crossed the 90 feet while he was walking away from her, low along the base of the air handlers where the noise was worst. There are perhaps a few thousand people in the United States who have handled that particular initiator, and most of them are engineers. And a very small number of them are flight medics who spent 4 years in an aviation regiment where everyone learned the same 3 things about explosives, whether it was their job or not. She got 2 fingers behind the cap where it's seated into the well, worked it back out without twisting it, carried it to the floor drain at the base of the chilled water line, and dropped it through the grate into the standing water below. Then she pulled the block off the door seam, walked it 30 feet down the corridor, and pushed it through the steel door of the pump room, and shut that door behind it. He came back for it 7 minutes later when the sound of boots started coming up the garage stair, and what he found was a bare door frame in no time at all. What he did next was the thing that killed him, and it was not bad luck. He went into the bag for the second block, and he cut the fuse short because the men were already on the stairs, a great deal shorter than he had any business cutting it. In the dark, with a flashlight clamped under his jaw, and he crimped the cap and struck the igniter, and never got past the second step of backing away. The sound in that low concrete space was enormous and flat, and the pressure of it came down the corridor and moved the gurney 4 inches, and every fire door on the level slammed itself against its frame at once. Pike's team came up through the smoke 10 seconds behind it. The tall one and the third man were taken alive at the west end of the mechanical corridor, and it was not dramatic. They came out from behind a chilled water line with their hands empty and their weapons on the floor, because the alternative was 4 federal officers in a corridor with no exits, and because men in that line of work are extremely good at arithmetic. Talia was standing over Stroud's gurney when Pike's light found her with a pistol in her hands that she had picked up off the floor 11 feet from what was left of the man who set the charge. It was the only minute of the entire night that she had held a weapon. She put it down on the sheet by his feet before Pike had finished saying her name, and she did not touch it again. Stroud started talking at 6 quar, and it came out of him in short, broken stretches, because the overpressure in that basement had done something to his lungs that would take weeks to settle. By 7:2 they had all of it. 41 pounds of composition C4 and a case of initiators, less what had been spent under the hospital, were sitting in a leased storage unit in Cicero, 9 minutes from the loading dock of a distribution center that employed 212 people. Federal agents rolled that door up at 8:20 that same morning, and not one of those 212 people ever knew any of it had happened. He gave them the man at the Kestrel Group who had bought him out of the grave 5 years earlier and had been paying him ever since. And when Pike put the question to him about Kandahar, Stroud gave them that too. The names of the crew, the schedule, and the approach profile had come out of a coalition logistics liaison who had retired 11 months after the strike with a clean record and a pension, and who had spent the last 4 years drawing a consulting fee from Kestrel. Talia was standing in the doorway when he said it. She did not react, and she did not ask a single follow-up question. And Pike, watching her, understood that she had just been handed the rest of her life's work, and had accepted it without comment. The 2 men taken alive in the basement were charged in the Northern District of Illinois, and the charges ran long. At 7:15, they moved Stroud out of the recovery unit under federal escort, bound for military custody. He said one thing to Talia before the doors closed. He said that she should have let him go, and that she was going to think about that for the rest of her life. She did not answer him. She stood there until the gurney was out of sight, and then she went and washed her hands, and that was the last time the 2 of them were ever in a room together. Graham Wexler did not apologize, and Talia would not have known what to do with it if he had. But what he did instead was rewrite his incident report in the field describing the placement of the balloon tamponade in the left subclavian wound at 3:19 in the morning. He entered that the procedure had been performed under the verbal direction of the attending physician, and he signed his own name to it, and he filed it with risk management at 7, while Marilyn Vance was still on the telephone with the hospital's counsel. It was not true. It ended the review. It ended the notification to the nursing board. And it moved the entire weight of a procedure, performed outside the scope of practice, onto a man with a signature on the chart, in which was exactly where he had spent 6 years believing weight belonged. Vance read the amended report and looked at him for a moment longer than she needed to, and accepted it without a single question, because she knew precisely what it was, and knew equally well that it closed the file. He found Talia at the end of the recovery corridor at 7:05, with her coat over her arm. "You're not coming back for the next shift," he said. "Are you?" Talia unclipped the badge from the front of her scrubs, the one with the photograph taken by a woman in human resources who had told her to look at the light, and she put it into his hand. "I don't think Standard nursing procedure covers what happened in that basement. Dr. Wexler. Leona Briggs was standing at the triage desk when Talia went past it. She did not say anything, and she did not try to stop her, and she watched all the way down the corridor to the ambulance bay doors, thinking about 2 years and 4 months of sitting 9 feet from a woman she had liked and joked with and complained about the parking with, and had never once actually met. It had not been a performance. That was the part that stayed with her. Nobody had been hiding anything. The woman who walked out through those doors at 7:35 in the morning was the same woman who had been sitting at that desk every night for 2 years. The only thing that had changed was that somebody had finally been in the room when it mattered. Pike was waiting in the ambulance bay, and the sleet had stopped, and the sky over the west side had gone the flat gray that Chicago wears in the hour before a working morning. He pushed open the outer door and held it, and the cold came in, and he told her they had a long road ahead of them. Talia Mercer walked out into it. Because night stalkers don't quit. Here's the thing worth carrying out of this one. Every building you walk into has somebody in it like Talia Mercer, sitting quietly at a desk, doing an ordinary job, carrying something nobody around them has ever thought to ask about. We decide who people are by the uniform they happen to have on that day, and we are wrong about it constantly. The woman at the triage desk had saved more lives before breakfast in a war than most of that hospital would see in a career. And for 2 years and 4 months, not one person asked her a single question about herself. So maybe the small thing is this. The person beside you is almost always more than the version of them you have settled on. If this story stayed with you, that's Mystic Chapters. Subscribe and stick around. We've got more of these coming, and I'd like you here for it.